72% of global workers suffer from loneliness at least monthly, and 55% at least weekly. COVID and the move to remote work increased isolation. Some might say that as tech advances, work gets faster, the digital world continues to become more native for generations, especially the ones that are going to be entering the workforce in the future and flooding the workforce, that loneliness is going to continue to grow. So we're here today with Ryan Jenkins and Stephen Van Cohen to talk about their brand new book called Connectable, How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. First question, could you have better timed a release of a book?
We planned it all out just for the release of the book. I mean, it is amazing when things align to perfection, isn't it?
It is. We're really happy to have you with us. It'll be an exciting conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure's all ours. So I feel like it's a relatively new topic, talking about loneliness, especially in public, but you are founders of lessened.com, which is a resource for addressing workplace loneliness and creating more belonging at work. You've worked with a number of large organizations across several industries, and you have years of experience. So tell us about how you went about the process of reaching your findings in the book and what you feel might be an insight into the problem or potential solution that really shifted your perspective.
Yeah, so our work on loneliness started back in 2019. We were doing some studies around Generation Z, and we wrote a book about that generation because they were the next generation to flood into the workforce. And we found through those studies that Gen Z was the loneliest generation. And we found that very troublesome. We tried to figure out, why is that? And what could we do to help this generation? And so we began exploring it and trying to learn more and more about loneliness. And it was then the pandemic happened, and we took all this loneliness research and we brought it to some of our clients thinking, I don't know, are people going to want to talk about loneliness? Because humanity's never wanted to talk about loneliness. And we didn't think that they still would, especially in the work context. But we were dead wrong, and everyone wanted to talk about it. And so that propelled our research even further. We ended up actually researching, studying 2,000 global workers. And the statistic that you mentioned at the top is where we found all that. We started working with 50 global leaders, and we've worked with hundreds of organizations now at this point with unpacking this idea of loneliness and how is it showing up at work. And I think what became most standout for us was this idea that loneliness lies at the intersection of inclusion and well-being. And so when we focus on addressing loneliness, it obviously boosts the well-being of teams and individuals, but it also allows us to show up more fully at work, which we can talk about in a little bit if you'd like. And so we're actually able to be more higher performing as well. So it's a really kind of get a double whammy when we start thinking about loneliness, and it's no longer a soft topic, but it's a really dire one that Steve and I are really excited to broach the topic with organizations and give them some tools to attack it, because there's a lot of upside here.
Absolutely. And in terms of Gen Z, I think it's really interesting to share that, first of all, it's a population set of about 68 million here in the United States. But what's most interesting is that this entire generation is younger than Google. It's the first generation that's been online their entire lives. So here you are, super advanced in technology, but you're still wanting that human connection. You're still longing for some of the most basic needs. And what I found interesting from your book was this perspective that, some of this is on us, like our generation right now, just making sure that that next generation actually feels that human connection. Otherwise, it could be disastrous. I don't want to say disastrous. It could be less than ideal for how they, continue to live their lives.
Is going to be disastrous. Like, you can use that word with confidence. All of the research that we've done, and as we've started to learn about the physical, emotional, impact that this is having, it is a big deal. This isn't just like, oh yeah, we should be connected because it seems like the right thing to do. There are real ramifications, right? So in the book, we have this graphic that says essentially, like, if loneliness had a warning label, it would read, and there's a big chunk of all of the different impacts that loneliness has on us physically. It causes obviously mental health and depression. It causes cardiovascular issues. It causes all kinds of different, stress responses. So what's happening is when we're feeling lonely, our brains have kicked into a fight or flight, and that has released the stress hormone. And we know that stress is really bad for us. So for people who are chronically lonely, they're in a state of nonstop stress. And if we multiply that out over millions of people over lots of years, that's a disaster, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you sort of began these conversations with the global leaders, 50 global leaders, it sounded like they were very much aware that this was a problem, very much wanting to talk about it. Were there any like misconceptions that you came across that you were able to kind of debunk through this book? Because I'm wondering, for that global leader out there that may be new to this problem, I wonder like what they may be thinking that you may be able to help kind of refine for them.
Yeah, I mean, there's still pushback on the word loneliness. So we're not just going to get over it in a snap. It's still shrouded in some shame. But boy, there's a reason we're talking today, right? Because the word loneliness probably piqued your interest, and I'm willing to bet most, if not all, of the listeners are leaning in because it's a universal human condition. We all experience it, and yet we've never talked about it. And so this is really important. So that's one of the things to your question there, Jay, is we've had to kind of help. We've had to use different terms at times to kind of get around it. We've had to talk about belonging or inclusion or team connection. And we kind of use that as the Trojan horse to get in the organization, and then talk about loneliness. And the feedback is always the same, like, wow, I had no idea, this is helpful. And one of our goals is to destigmatize it, right? And really to allow people to start making it much more accessible. And that was a tough thing right in the book too, because our publisher didn't want the term loneliness in the title, which is, we get it, right? Like, alcoholics, they're not going to buy a book about that says alcoholics on it, right? Like, right. So we have to kind of treat it. We had to kind of dance around some things to make it palatable for some folks, and then really make sure that we make the content very accessible and, not put any shame around it. We put 50 fun illustrations in the book that were humorous, again, to make this topic really informative. But the last thing, to your point, Jay, or to your question around, what pushback or misconceptions did leaders have? I think the other thing is that they feel like loneliness is not their job. It's not their job to help people with loneliness. That's a personal problem that should happen outside of work. Mm-hmm. Well, work and life, the line between work and life is all but gone these days. And the way Steve and I frame it in the book is, as a leader, when your people are on the bus, they're your responsibility. Their mental health is your responsibility. So create environments and lean into this to make sure that they leave the bus, fuller and healthier and more engaged. You can't control what happens outside the bus, but when they're on the bus, lean into it. And then the last thing, I'll be quiet, is it doesn't take much, right? Because leaders think, oh my gosh, like, well, this is, I can't lessen loneliness. This just seems surmountable. And the results after results, feedback after feedback we get from our audience is they're like, this is refreshing because it's accessible. Like, I don't have to overhaul my company culture. I don't have to convince all these executives. It just takes me, and I can do very simple pro-social behaviors to move the needle. So it just takes a little bit of awareness and some intentional tools to really pick away at this thing and really create a healthier, more engaged team, ultimately a healthier, more engaged community and humanity.
Nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it feels like we're on the brink of, like, this conversation is unveiling, I think, a silent creeper, a silent danger in the workplace. And when you think about some of the stats around, what loneliness can cause, I mean, it could shave 12 years off of your life. And if you're over a certain age, I think it's 64, you have a really high chance of, developing dementia if you don't have people around you. So this is a really big deal, right? So it's just like, if you're a leader out there, you're listening to this, think about, how do you expect your workforce to really show up if, number one, there's loneliness, and then all of the side effects associated with loneliness are also occurring in your, employees. So, if you don't think that's a big deal, I think it's something to consider as a leader, just because, like, how do you expect your workforce to really show up if they're feeling all of this?
They can't. right? So we say in the book that a lonely workforce is essentially distracted at best and debilitated at worst. Like, and some more interesting research, my favorite research that we uncovered as we were going through our process was about the way the brain interprets feeling rejected, lonely, isolated, etc. And what they found is the same part of the brain that registers physical pain is the part of the brain that registers feelings of loneliness.
It's amazing.
Which is crazy, right? But over a millennia of evolution, we knew that our survival was so important, right? To be one with the pack. Like we could not take down the saber-toothed tiger. We could not defeat a woolly mammoth by ourselves. We were in real dire, dangerous situations if we were ousted by the tribe, or if we lost the tribe, or if we decided on our own to go and forge our own trail, that our brains said, hey, this is as important for your survival as being physically assaulted, right? Or being physically hurt or attacked. So when you're having people come to work that are feeling lonely, right? The brain is essentially sending out those fight or flight signals that I mentioned earlier. You can't do your deep, meaningful, like incredible work if that is what's registering in your brain. So again, this is something that we say it's not a soft topic, it's a dire one for a reason, right? If we want to get the best out of our teams, we have to be able to make sure they feel fully connected, or else we're sacrificing a lot on the table.
Yeah. And there, there's obviously an intersection here between work and life and family and romantic relationships and friendships and some of the other societal trends that have maybe even put, my generation in a position where they're less invested in a community. They're less, embedded in a network of people getting married later, starting families later. Like how much can being connected at work ameliorate some of those problems? Like how much can work provide people in terms of connection?
Well, Jay, really quick. I think this is really important to unpack for your listeners is why we're feeling more lonely. Because if we can give some context to the reasons for why this is happening, and it's not just because of COVID, there are a lot of underlying reasons for it, then we can start to get back into why is work the best place to essentially address this.
Nice.
So there's essentially three major reasons for why people are feeling lonelier than ever. And pre-pandemic, there were some statistics that came out that said 61% of Americans in 2018 felt lonely, right? So 61%, that's still a really big number.
Yeah.
Obviously that's increased as we've been forced to social distance and, not have as much face-to-face interaction. But even before all the craziness started, people felt really lonely. So the three big reasons are, one is what we call dependency shift. So back 20 years ago, if I wanted to get a good recommendation for where to take a date, I would have had to call a friend, or if something broke in my house, I would have to go talk to a neighbor. Like I depended on other people for pretty much everything. Yeah. Now, if something breaks, I go to YouTube. If I need a review, I go to Yelp. If I need advice, I go to Google. I no longer am dependent on other people. So just the amount of exposure that I'm having on a day-to-day basis from a helpful hand standpoint is all but gone, right? For a lot of us. The second component is busyness. Busyness is one of the biggest issues with regards to feeling lonely, because if I'm busy, I'm taking less time to connect with others. I'm taking less time to connect with myself. I don't have as much time to connect with my friends and family. So the busier we are, and anybody who's nodding their head going, yep, I'm busy. Most people I know are busy. That's a big issue as it relates to, why people are feeling the way they're feeling. And then the last is what we call the catch of convenience. So we now live in a world where everything we want is on demand. And we live in an amazing kind of frictionless ecosystem where I don't have to talk to the barista anymore at Starbucks. I just order online and I scoop my coffee up. I no longer need to go into a restaurant to get food. It's delivered to my door, right? Amazon has allowed us to basically be couch potatoes for the majority of our adult life. So we're not just out in the wild, like bumping shoulders with other people. And because of those three things, we're living a very different life than we lived 15 years ago. And that's a main reason why we're feeling exponentially lonely. So to bring back to your question, Jay, and I'll have Ryan answer this. Why is work the best place? We call it the most fertile ground for loneliness to be lessened. I'll let him go ahead and answer that.
Cool.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, those are good causes of loneliness that we all need to be aware of. And it's pretty crazy when we step back. We all feel it, but sometimes it takes kind of connecting these dots to be like, oh yeah, that's exactly right. I think we probably should have started here, and that's on me not starting here, but the definition of loneliness is going to help us answer this question. And loneliness is not the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. So you could be in a crowded room full of people and still feel very isolated and removed from humanity. Or you can also work remotely and feel very connected and non-lonely. So it's really about connection. And why work is such a fertile place to address loneliness is because there's so many loneliness lifelines. There's so many connection points. So when you show up to work, right, there's first connection is connection with yourself. Second connection, there's team members. You've got connections with your manager. You got connections to your work, to the organizational culture. And you also, within work there's routine, there's natural connections, right? We spend the most of our waking hours there at work. There's learning that's constantly happening, and learning starves loneliness. So it's such a fertile ground to really address loneliness. And most of us are typically engaged in work at some level on a day-to-day basis. So why not start there to attack this vicious problem?
Makes sense.
Yeah, and a lot of it seems like we continue to go against nature, right? So, talking about dependency shifts, now all of a sudden we have these smartphones which seem to be trivializing. Is that how you say it? Oh,
Yeah.
Conversations. It's late, man. Conversations. When it comes to just the busyness, right? It's like we're in our society, everyone says I'm busy when you ask them how they're doing, right? So the value of saying I'm busy is increasing, but the value of saying that I'm actually relaxing, I'm actually taking some time for myself, that's declining, even though we know how important it is. So again, I just feel like we continue to go against what nature has us designed, or nature has us intended to do, which again is a wake-up call. Like, let's just reconnect to who we are at the core and go from there. But yeah, I mean, how do we actually maybe loop in that need for immediacy? Like, how is that? I think you kind of touched on it, but playing into the feeling of loneliness, the need for immediacy, playing into the feeling of loneliness in the context of remote working, in the context when instant isn't fast enough. What could you say around that?
Well, the research shows that loneliness can be lessened in as little as 40 seconds. So this isn't like, okay, we all of a sudden have to just spend hours a day really having deep, meaningful conversations with other people. Not the case. When you know what to do, and Ryan mentioned this word earlier, they're called pro-social behaviors. Pro-social behaviors is like, I'm really listening to you in this moment. Even if it's for just a few short minutes, if you know that I'm really tuned in and care about what you're saying, you're going to feel connected to me. So that's one pro-social behavior. Empathy is another one. Like, if I'm there for you and I'm able to just understand your perspective, if I'm asking you questions to pull things out of you, empathizing, great pro-social behavior. Asking for advice, we're I'm leaning on you and then you're leaning on me and we can give each other advice and feedback. That's a pro-social behavior. So this isn't something that is going to require an exuberant amount of effort, which is awesome, right? Like, we can essentially make a dent in this loneliness situation pretty easily. But the key is knowing what to do. And essentially that's why we wrote the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to that point, I mean, go ahead.
Arjun, I'll jump in here. Because another reason, or to your question, is our brain's misleading us. So we're kind of to your point too, right? We're going against our biology, but our brain's misleading us. And there was a specific study that made this really apparent. Nick Epley out of the University of Chicago did this research recently where he was trying to figure out why people on the commuter train in and out of Chicago weren't connecting. He's like, there's all these stories and jokes that people have, and we're just keeping to ourselves. So he decided to study it. So he made 3 conditions. There was the solitude condition, where people were asked to keep to themselves. There was the normal condition, or the control condition, and people were asked to do what they normally would do. And of course, what did they do? Kept to themselves. And the third was the connection condition. Those people were asked to create connections with strangers. And after the research, they surveyed everybody and they said everyone was happier in that connection condition. Whether you were the initiator or the receiver, whether you were introvert or extrovert, you had the best experience. Your well-being was boosted when you were in the connection condition. And then he tested this on buses and taxis and waiting rooms and airports, and all had the same result. People were happier when they spent time connecting. But here's the kicker. All the people tested or before this research, they were asked what they thought they would be the most, what would make them the most happy, or where they would be the most satisfied. And they all thought if they kept to themselves, they would be more satisfied. So literally our brain's misleading us. We think that our connection point is going to be cumbersome, or it's going to be anxiety ridden, or we're going to be an inconvenience for other people. But that's just not the case. And we've all experienced this, right? When we have that subtle connection or that conversation, we do feel better. We feel a certain vigor, and our well-being is boosted. So we have to be aware of this conversation. And next time you think about directing your attention to your phone while standing in line, don't do it, and look up and try to smile at someone or ask someone how their day's going.
Yeah. One quick thing, just jumping in there. When I was reading that part of your book, made me think of an interaction that I had recently in my own life. I go pretty regularly to this sandwich place just below my apartment building. And, I like put the order in, and then a guy comes out and delivers the sandwich. And I noticed it was, for a couple of weeks there, it was the same guy who would come out and give me the sandwich. And he always calls my name, Jay, and to come and grab the sandwich. And I realized he's said my name probably like 3 or 4 times, and I don't know his name. So I was just like, hey man, like, what's your name? And he's like, I'm Zach. And now, every time he gives a sandwich, you say, what's up, Jay? I get to say, what's up, Zach? And just that little thing, to use your word, there's so much vigor in just that small interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
I have a client, she's in Canada, and during the heart of the shutdowns up there, I asked him, like, how are you doing? She lives alone. Her kids are grown. She's just got a dog. And she said, I'm actually doing really well. She goes, I've made it a point to make friends every time I walk my dog. So any like interaction from the people she passes when she's dog walking was enough for her to be like, I actually feel really good. I've made like more friends during COVID than I have like in a long time. But it's that intentionality of just like, what's your name? Hey, how are you? What's going on? But it's genuine and it's meaningful. And when those underlying conditions are present, that's when two people can have that kind of 40-second exchange where, yeah, we both leave feeling, okay, that's good. He sees me, I see him. Right on. Let's keep rolling.
Totally.
The statement that kind of sums up everything we're talking about here is connections don't have to be lasting to be meaningful. I fall prey to that constantly, right? That I just like, well, I used to before this book. Now I don't. But, if I always thought, well, if this person's not going to be an integral part of my life, I'm not going to see him again. Why spend the time to invest in that connection? And research after research just says that's flat out false. Take the time to connect. Connections don't have to be lasting to be meaningful. They can be as simple as grabbing a sandwich from Zach.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
Or even at the dog park, I can relate to that as well. I mean, just having conversations with folks at the dog park. Most of the time, the first few interactions, you talk about the dog and the dog's name. And then at some point you just be like, well, what's your name? And then like that starts, the next level of the potential, relationship there. But Stephen, to your point, you mentioned 40 seconds. So just numbers for people to remember: 0.6, 1, and 5. 0.6 minutes. 40 seconds is how long it takes for loneliness to lessen during a 2-minute convo. One person is the number of work friends it takes to feel less lonely. And 5 minutes is the amount of time it takes in a team meeting to share something personal. So I think it's a collective effort that we may need to exhibit, and it's a collective movement to keep each other going. But 0.6, 1, and 5.
Well said.
Yes. Nice.
Someone did his homework, and I appreciate you giving us, we call it the code, right? But it's like a pretty simple code that if we actually put it to good use, it's going to crack some more belonging and give us a deeper feeling, more rooted sense of connection, which is awesome. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, let's get into that code a little bit more. You actually set out a framework, a 4-step process using the letters of the word link, LINK, to represent each step. Maybe now is a good time to walk through those steps, some of the key themes and strategies that are associated with them. The first one is L, look at loneliness. You're saying to identify that it even exists, not only with yourself, but others. But can you extrapolate on that?
Yeah, Ryan, how about I do L and you do I?
Sounds good.
Beautiful.
There
Teamwork.
we go.
Love that.
So L, we call it look at loneliness, and looking is multifaceted. So really it means, one, looking at loneliness in the sense of understanding it. And the book is our attempt to give hopefully a pretty good case for why we need to start paying attention to it and doing something about it. You need to look at loneliness in self. So, we've designed some assessments, and in the book, we've given some different kind of parameters for how to identify your loneliness level. And it's important for self because once you know where you're at, and once you can take some time to sit with experiences in your life where you might have felt lonely, you're just more in tune to be able to, connect with somebody else, empathize, and be ready to, know where they're at and if they're feeling it in that moment. And then the third is to look at loneliness in others. And there are a whole bunch of signs. We say that loneliness signs can be elusive, but when you know what to look for, you can start to pinpoint, hey, like there's some things going on with Ryan, and based on the list, I got to maybe have a quick intervention. So looking at loneliness in others are things like, have this person decommitted from learning and development? So if they're not trying to learn, grow, build skills, go above and beyond, if they don't seem really inspired with their work, that could be a sign. Is this person not offering input as often? Like, is their camera off during video calls? Do they just not show up as regularly? Is this person showing any kind of an apathetic attitude or an unkempt appearance? And then really, is this person showing a break in routine? They're just not doing what they usually do. And then the two other ones are, is this person overworking? Because usually we overwork to compensate for some of the gaps in our personal life. And is this person only talking about work? Because again, they don't necessarily feel comfortable sharing with maybe others what's going on in their personal life if they're not happy with it. So looking at loneliness in the topic, in self and others, that whole chapter is really just kind of the first step, because we can't do anything unless we're spotting it. So that's what the L in the link model stands for.
Yeah, and the I is invest in connection. So once we kind of understand and have that awareness from the first step, as Steve highlighted, the next step is, okay, we got to invest in connection. So how do I start investing in connections? And so that could be from a leader perspective, right? How do we start creating connections? How do I start connecting with my team members as a leader? How do I help create environments where my team members can connect with each other? But one great way to do this is through peer coaching. So peer coaching is kind of just exactly what it sounds like. You find a peer of yours and you engage in coaching sessions, and it's non-evaluative. That's really important. It's not evaluative. So one person just shares kind of what's going on at work and life, and the other person just listens, asks questions, and then the roles switch. And it kind of throws off the stigma of being in these types of engagements or conversations where you can dig a little bit, you can express more. Kind of helps when there's a framework to it. So if you're an individual, approach someone else by having a something like that, a peer-to-peer coaching, or if you're a leader, encourage those types of engagements to happen. Because again, the idea is to invest in connection. We've got to start. A good question for all of us to ask ourselves is, am I relatable? Right? And the question is, the question is, I don't know if I'm relatable. Well, you probably need to share a little bit more about who you are, so that other people can find those connection points and you can start developing deeper connections with each other. So the second step is invest in connection.
Absolutely. So kind of on those lines, are there workers that are more prone to loneliness?
Yes, there are. There's a whole slew of research that kind of highlights, well, let me back up. We all experience loneliness. It's a universal human condition. Some experience it more intensely than others, but it's something that we all experience. and there's certain industries and there are certain types of folks that actually experience it more. The industries that are really susceptible to loneliness is it's the legal field, science, and government. And then, but the things that really don't affect loneliness much is race, ethnicity, geographic location, age. Salary does a little bit, but not enough to really make it a significant thing. Some of the things that make people more susceptible to loneliness, they're single, childless. There's some other aspects too. I don't have the notes right in front of me, but there are subtle things. But if you're a leader, we always encourage folks to just say, assume that everyone's feeling a certain level of disconnection, because according to our research, they are. And so just assume that. So start there. But there's some more details that we have in the book that really kind of highlights who's most susceptible. So that's helpful. If you have a lot of folks that fall in those categories, then you need to really tune in. So we do a lot of work in the legal field, because those folks are just they have so much on their plate. They're constantly delivering for their clients, and they feel very, very isolated just because they're so busy. And so I imagine the same thing is in the science field as well. So there's probably a higher degree of introversion there as well. But yeah, hopefully that helps give you a little bit more context there.
It does. And before we get to the next two components of your 4-step framework, there was a leadership tip in your book that I thought was important to share, because again, you're talking about investing in connections. And so if you're a leader, do what Nelson Mandela's dad did. Nelson Mandela's dad was the chief. And what Nelson Mandela learned from him about leadership was two things. Number one, have meetings in circles. But number two, more importantly, be the last person to speak. The reason that's so important is because if you are going to invest in connection, well, having your 5 or 6 teammates speak before you share your thoughts opens up more creativity and opens up more ground, so that the person speaking or the employee speaking doesn't feel like they're going to go against what the chief or the leader might have originally said, right? So if you're a leader and you talk first, well, you're influencing everyone and how they're going to speak back. So the leadership tip, if you want to invest in connection, is to sit in a circle and speak last.
I use that tip with lots of clients, and it's one of those really basic things that we don't think about that has a fundamental shift in just how people operate, right? And a leader can go into a team meeting and say, here's the problem, but I want to hear all of your potential ideas for a solution. And they can just stop and only ask questions and not give any kind of indication if they agree or disagree by nodding or shaking their head or doing any nonverbal cue, is a powerful statement that says, like, I really care about what you have to say. So much so that I'm willing to go at the very end. And most leaders don't do that. There was a statistic, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it like 88% of teams underperform when leaders are speaking the majority of the time? So yeah, like if you're a leader out there, like you have a team for a reason, let's make sure that they have the microphone first, and then you'll be able to share your thoughts and perspectives after you've heard what they all have to say.
And this correlates with this category in the model, the invest in connection. We sub bullet down into personal connections, professional, and then safe connections. So this would be categorized as creating safe connections. And so ultimately we're creating psychological safety, right? If we create environments where people feel like they can speak up and they can be heard, it's creating psychological safety, which is really important because it satisfies the core question of humanity, which according to research, our brain is asking 5 times per second. And that question is, am I safe? Right? We're constantly asking that. Our entire body is asking us that constantly. Am I safe? Am I safe? Of course, it's unconscious. We're not all thinking about it. But what does it look like for a team that in an organization that can satisfy that question, that can quiet that voice in your mind that's constantly asking, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? What type of performance can we get? What kind of connections and better well-being can be fostered when we can quiet and satisfy that core human question?
Yeah. And on the flip side of it, how destructive is it to an employee when the answer is like, no, 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 like
Right.
repeatedly over and over again? Sometimes you find yourself in those work environments.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because imagine when that is running in your mind and subconsciously. I mean, how are you supposed to narrow the focus, which is step 3? How could you illuminate what's important at work if all day long you're just fearful, and then it turns into projecting your own insecurities around that fear. So it becomes a compounding effect in the negative direction.
100%. Well, let's talk about narrowing the focus, because that was the most eye-opening chapter for me as we were writing this, because I just assumed that, if you're feeling lonely, just go forge a connection. It's just
Yeah.
about you and another person having a moment together, and then boom, you're good to go. But that's not the case. So narrowing the focus is all about doing really tactical things at work that can pull somebody back into a state of feeling connected. And a couple of my favorites. One is essentially, like, we call it, identify the beneficiaries of the labor. What that means is when somebody can draw a straight line from what they do to the impact that they have, that is the fastest way to pull somebody from feeling disconnected and isolated back to full strength. Because if I feel important, if I feel valued, if I feel appreciated, all of a sudden that does wonders for my just own, like, personal kind of mindset. It does wonders for how I look at the way that I'm interacting with others. It boosts my confidence. So finding ways through work to have clear purpose and clear impact is a really, really important strategy. And like, if you're a leader, that's a lot easier to do than essentially sit down and say, Jay, you look really lonely, man. Like, can we talk about your loneliness? Like, one of those is a lot less scary. If we can, as a team, figure out, like, how are we impacting our clients? What are we doing to the community? What's our work, essentially allowing us to achieve that's bigger than ourselves? That feels really connective. So that's the first strategy from that chapter that I really love. And then the second is around this idea of progress, which is weird. You wouldn't think that, progress has anything to do with loneliness. But one of the most motivating and engaging components to work is our sense of feeling progress. So if I'm able to notate that I'm moving in the right direction versus the wrong direction, I'm way more susceptible to lean into the work, lean into the work, team, lean into my leader. And identifying progress in a group is not something that naturally gets done, but through our research, is a really powerful way to lessen loneliness and boost connection.
Interesting.
Maybe a way to do that is more quick one-on-one meetings with the manager, if that's necessary, just to understand if you are working the right direction. And if you are going a little bit off track, what you can do to identify and, strengthen some of those weaknesses, which is a good thing, by the way. When you identify weaknesses, it makes you feel more human, by the way, because here you are, you think that you're this perfect individual, you have all these strengths, and then all of a sudden you're faced with brand new, unique situations, and you realize where you're weak. And then it's like, wow, great, I have something to work on now. So the way I look at weakness is, it's very uncomfortable at first. It can mess with your mind, but it also gives you something to do. Like, work on it. So
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's about progress. It's about progress.
Well said. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other piece of that too is, if you feel connected to the work and you feel like you're being recognized for your labor and like your contributions to the team, there's more of just a more positive, like, undercurrent throughout the day while you're working. You're like, you feel, even when you're not directly interacting with people or interacting with your manager, you feel connected to something beyond yourself, versus if you never get recognized, you never get seen, then the work doesn't have any kind of like positive connection associated with it, it seems.
Well said. I totally agree.
Yeah. For this section, the narrow the focus, we looked at astronauts. We had to study astronauts because they operate in such seclusion, right? 250 plus miles away. And we specifically looked at Christina Koch. She interacted with, I think, about 11 individuals for an entire year.
Wow.
So introverts are rejoicing at that stat. But, it's, to your point, Jay, it's kind of, how do you astronauts have extreme clarity. They know the mission, up safely, down safely. And then they have extreme clarity in what they do day to day. And then I think the other component too that helps astronauts is when they're up there, they can see the world, and I think they get a completely different perspective, and it gives them a different connection to humanity when they can see it from that perspective. So I'll leave it there, but certainly astronauts was fascinating to study and how they really keep loneliness at bay.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then that leads us to step 4, which is kindling the momentum, and, keep what's working, progressing, basically inflame what's working to sustain progress.
Yeah, we start that chapter by looking at the individual that started the first social network, which you guys have done your homework, so you know the answer, but I'm going to pause for the listeners to think, who was the first creator of the social network? And it, of course, was not Zuckerberg or Dorsey or Tom from MySpace. It was a young brave who created Fire, right? Fire, if you think about it, Fire, when people came around it and we started gathering around it, was really kind of the first network. But that's what kind of the theme is throughout the whole chapter there is, you've created this momentum, you've sparked some connections. Now, how do you take that torch of connection and continuously keep lighting up certain areas? Because it has to be continuous and has to be a cycle. The framework is a circle, because you think about your well-being at like the battery of a phone. You don't just you don't connect to a charging station once and then you're charged forever.
Yeah.
You have to keep recharging. Same is true for humans. We don't have one connection with someone one day and our well-being's boosted forever. We have to constantly keep at it. And for leaders and individuals who want to lessen loneliness and create meaningful connections, they gotta consistently kindle that momentum and keep revisiting, keep looking at loneliness, keep investing in connections, and continue to narrow the focus.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, how can someone reconnect with a lonely and distrusting person? Let's say somebody is really lonely. They're feeling they can't trust people around them. How can you pull them out? Or should you? I mean, what responsibility do you really have? Because at the end of the day, we were kind of alluding to it earlier. It's on the person to really get out of it. But as a leader, it's on you to surface it, identify it, and realize that this tension exists. But I mean, at what point do you step in?
Yeah. Well, there's also a difference between being lonely and being depressed. There's a difference between being lonely and having a whole slew of other mental health, diagnoses. So when we think about someone who's lonely, there's also a difference between what's called situational loneliness and chronic loneliness. Situational loneliness is what most of us deal with at some point in time, right? Like we lose a loved one, we move and we don't know a whole lot of people, we get a new job, we change teams, we are undertaking a new project and we don't have all the answers. That feels lonely. So situational loneliness comes in spurts. Chronic loneliness, when someone every single day wakes up and says, wow, I really am not happy with the way that I'm connecting with others. That's a bit more rare. The research shows that only 20% of people who feel loneliness are chronically lonely. So back to your question, Arjun, of what do you do? If you're the leader or a friend or, just a team member, and you recognize, I think this individual really needs some help. The pro-social behaviors that we talk about are really good ones. The first one I would do if it was me is I would go to that person and I would ask for advice. I would say, Arjun, I have this situation going on. What would you do if you were me? That is a really quick way for that person to feel valued, important, knowledgeable, credible, etc. So that's one quick thing that I can do with you in a few minutes to try to get you back into reality. The other is learning. Learning is a really good strategy for, we say learning starves loneliness, because when you're learning, you're hopeful. When you're building new skills, that's confidence boosting. So if I I wanted to pull someone out of the depths of loneliness, I would say like, hey, how about we read this book together? Or how about we do this online course? Or how about we watch this YouTube video? I found it really interesting. Let's talk about it. Like if you can just find ways to do activities together that are non-threatening, that maybe align with some of their interests, it's all those little tiny subtle things that are essentially just giving them a nod like, hey, I'm here for you. Hey, like, let's do this. Hey, let's talk about that. And the more nods you can give, hopefully that's the breakthrough. But, at the end of the day, there's no magic wand solution. All we can do is do our best and leverage some of the things that we know work, but it's not 100% accurate every time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Are there unique challenges to creating connections across generations? So if there's a 50-year-old manager out there who is maybe managing a team of mostly Gen Zers, is it harder for him to or her to portray themselves as relatable to their younger teammates?
Yeah. It's the generational gap can be cause challenges. Typically, we identify or we create stronger, quicker connections with folks that are within our same generation. Typically, organizations that are trying to hire millennials or Gen Zers, they're going to use millennials or Gen Zers to hire those folks, just because you can create quicker bridges and again build that connection a lot swifter. But at the same time, I think one of the best ways that leaders can overcome that is to kind of act like a coach, right? Resist advice giving and just ask more questions, right? Just be really curious about the other individual. And then it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about, am I being relatable? So have you shared something recently that someone can find an uncommon connection with? And another cool thing that we've seen a lot of organizations do is they create employee profiles. It's really easy to do when someone joins an organization. You kind of understand, where did they grow up and what are some of their likes and dislikes, and you kind of get a flavor for who that individual is. And so that baby boomer, for example, leader might be able to find some connection points and use that as a launching point to create a stronger connection faster with someone that's outside their generation. So we got to be a little bit more intentional. We got to be a little bit more proactive, and also just be cautious too, because Steve and I unpack this at length in the book around how happy hours can be very detrimental and kind of counterintuitive to creating connection, because people tend to talk about what they have most in common, which typically is work. They tend to group within people that they know, like, or trust. And so if we want to create more connections across generations or from different departments, you have to be a little bit more intentional. Some organizations, they'll shake up the seating arrangement at different events, or maybe in the office to create some of these uncommon connections that wouldn't normally occur. Even one organization that we wrote about has a lunch once a week or a couple times a week. They'll have an auto-generated thing where it pairs two people that didn't know each other, and they go out to lunch, and the company covers that meal.
Nice.
So yeah, those are, again, subtle ways to kind of to bridge the generational gap. You got to work a little bit more when it's across generations. Kind of same thing if you have a hybrid team or remote team. You got to spend a little bit more extra attention, but those connections are still there. You just got to unearth them.
Absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, it comes down to where you're putting your attention and where you're focusing your attention, right? So if you're a leader, focusing some more of your attention on the fact that this could be an underlying issue that's sweeping through the company. If you're an employee, also think about where you're putting your attention. Are you also constantly thinking about how lonely you are? I mean, that's going to really define how you operate. So a lot of this comes down to where you're putting your attention and being really intentional about that as well. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. I think there's a lot that we can pull from. I have one final question. It's got nothing to do with this book.
All right.
It's for each of you. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's not so bad. What is the one thing you love most about yourselves?
Steve, go.
Oh, of course. Of course. I love that I don't throw my business partner under the bus right away when we get asked to do something. What do I love most about myself? the coolest part of the work that I get to do as a coach and as a consultant is I get to see things in people that they don't see in themselves. And then I get the luxury of being able to help them see those things. And I'm really good at that. I'm really good at being able to sit down with somebody and in a few minutes understand where they're at and give them words of encouragement and help them solve problems. And I'm a natural teacher. My parents were teachers. So that whole kind of component of coaching and doing that kind of work is something I love. And I've been doing it for 14 years successfully now. So I think I must be, doing it somewhat well.
You're an illuminator. We love that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
great.
That's true. I can vouch for him. I think for me, now that I have had some time to talk, thank you, Steve, or think. Yeah, I love seeing different connections with ideas and concepts. And I feel like I have a natural knack for kind of seeing a story and kind of figuring out what's the thing behind it and how can I connect that with another unseemingly different story or point. How can I connect those two? And that's why I love writing. And that's why it was so fun collaborating with Steve to write this book, because we start every chapter with a really unique story. And then, we weave it through the whole thing. And it's just fun to see the aha moment and see readers and folks nodding their heads. And so, that's what I really am very proud about how my brain works.
And I'll validate that you are a master at doing just that. So yes, very
Great
true.
answers.
Connecting the dots, finding where, what happens when you connect dots between seemingly uninteresting things, you learn like where your points of ignorance lie as well. So, I mean, I can definitely agree with that being something that also drives what Jay and I do here. Yeah, thank you for sharing space with us. I think, a conversation like this with 4 individuals talking about loneliness, making it something that is okay to talk about is a step in the right direction. Again, the book is called Connectable: How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. And it's available starting March 2nd, 2022.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.